Well, good evening, everyone. Nice that you're watching on this hot evening. Welcome to the live stream of SIP Utrecht, the Dutch United Nations Students Association, where we like to combine casual fun such as parties and a cold beer with a bit of intellectual fun such as workshops, debate nights, or as tonight, interesting talks. And tonight we'll be talking about the Third World War, a fantasy or a future. Because we're living through interesting times. And the beginning of this year, this was quite a hot topic when the USA airstriked an Iranian general. A lot of speculation on the Third World War were going around, but also, broadly speaking, tensions between China, Russia, USA, North Korea, Iran, India and China, India and Pakistan. There's a lot of tension in the world. So the term Third World War is often mentioned, often predicted. But how real is it? And if it were real, how would it look like and how would it affect the world as we know it? And today we'll be talking about this with Professor André Gerrits from Leiden University and the Klingendahl Institute and Lorena Vita from Utrecht University. And we'll listen to both their talks. They will both speak for about 20 minutes, followed by a short break where we can get some cold drink, hopefully. Afterwards, there's plenty of time for them to answer your questions, which you can ask in the chats on both YouTube and Facebook. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them there, and hopefully one of them can answer them for you. So now we'll start with Professor André Gerrits. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So the state of world politics and the chances of a Third World War. Well, as we already discussed before we went live, this is an absolutely depressing topic in quite depressing times, I would argue. But it depends. It depends on, well, it basically depends on our conclusion. Do we need to take the prospect of a Third World War seriously? Well, let me begin by giving the good news. My answer is no. I don't think that there is an immediate threat for any conflict at the global scale. There is no need to dig, let's say, our bomb shelters. But having said that, I mean, that's about the good news. There's a lot of bad news as well. And ISO already mentioned a couple of recent incidents. And I think when you take all those incidents together, particularly from the quote-unquote Western perspective, then the major issue, of course, is uncertainty. We are highly uncertain because of the volatility, the unpredictability of global politics. And that's what I'd like to focus on for a few minutes before I'm going into that other question, the risks of a Third World War. What's the essence of this uncertainty, of this global uncertainty? I think there are two basic issues here. One is that power at the global scale is both changing horizontally, if you like, and vertically. Vertical change basically means that we have to pose the question if power is changing, not so much between states, but within states. And it is, obviously, it is under the pressure of new technologies. It is under the pressure of the current pandemic. It may also be under the pressure of the growth of dictatorship or authoritarian forms of government and the decline of democracies. My idea is that the rough indicators of power will remain the same. And these rough indicators are the size of one's economy, the size of one's country, the size of one's population, the size of a nation's military budget. These will remain the main indicators, and that's the most important reason, obviously, why when we discuss the prospects of a new world war, we're actually talking about the relationship between China and the United States. The Chinese economy is rapidly growing, but there's no need to think that the US predominant position militarily will change anytime soon. I mean, the United States still spends approximately $700 billion yearly on its defense, which is more than the next 10 countries in line together, including China and Russia. And it's more obviously than the national budget of the majority of UN member states. That will not change. Now, that other question, if power is changing, what will be the impact and the influence of, let's say, non-material forces like, for example, a pandemic? But to say a few words about the global impact of COVID-19, the impact on global political relations. What's the impact of COVID-19? It's another question which has been recently and frequently posed. What's the impact on political systems internally? Will it eventually promote authoritarian forms of government? Will it eventually undermine democracy? It's not so very easy to come up with, let's say, general statements on the global political impact of COVID-19. I would say that intuitively, we probably believe that democracies will be better equipped to deal with the impact of COVID than dictatorships. Dictatorships are secretive. They don't want to share information with their citizens. They want to, they build facades to hide unpleasant activities. Look at China during the first few weeks of COVID-19. But if you take a more closer look, we see that democracies have dealt very differently with COVID-19, from very effective anti-COVID strategies to very poor ones. So surprisingly, one of the major variables here is not so much whether a country is democratic or authoritarian, but the political psychology of the leader seems to make a big difference. Both dictators, if you like, and democratically elected leaders have done a very poor job, which includes people like Bolsonaro and Trump, and to a lesser extent Boris Johnson in the UK, all democratically elected politicians who did a relatively poor job. And what they have in common, obviously, is a sort of populist, macho-style politics, which led to a serious underestimation of the COVID phenomenon. Now, this second aspect, which I mentioned in the beginning of my brief talk, that power is also changing between states, that's a frequently discussed phenomenon, obviously. What I have in mind here, in very simple and straightforward terms, is the transfer of power from the West to another part of the world. And that other part of the world is basically China, of course. The question is, what will this mean for the future of global politics, this transition of power? I think there are three, if you want to answer that question, including the answer to the question, will there be a third world war? I think you have to ask and answer three sub-questions. How will the United States behave in the foreseeable future? How will China behave in the foreseeable future? And are those historians or political scientists right who argue that a conflict between the two countries, between the US and China, is inevitable? How will the US behave? Well, this is 2020. We will have presidential elections within a couple of months. Trump, I would argue, is a typical representative, an extreme representative, I should argue, extreme representative of a typical American type of populism. Specifically American type of isolationism, of mercantilism. Trump believes, and partly rightly so, that American values are not necessarily universal values. And this creates a sense of isolationism. Trump believes, and perhaps rightly so, partially at least, that in trade, your gain is my loss. So he's a sort of a radical variant of an understream in American politics, which is well known and even historical. But given that he is so extreme, he is in a way a threat to global stability, I would argue. The same goes for China. If you look at China's foreign policy, you see a very clear chronology over the last 20 years or 30 years since China started its reforms. From Deng Xiaoping's maxim, hide your brightness. Deng Xiaoping was the communist leader who initiated the reforms in China, which basically said, let's focus on internal reform, and let's not engage in all kinds of foreign policy adventures. From hide your brightness, to peaceful rise, another typically Chinese slogan. China will be a different sort of superpower. We will rise economically, but we will rise peacefully in political military terms. To the current Chinese leadership, President Xi Jinping, who is definitely a different leader. who is much more assertive, if not aggressive, economically, militarily, and politically, who does not shy away from using Chinese nationalism in his domestic and foreign policies. Now, the third question, is a military conflict inevitable? What we have here in current global politics is, if you like, a status quo power, the current superpower, that is the United States, and a new superpower, a revisionist power, that is China. Well, there are quite a few historians and political scientists who argue if that is the situation, then a conflict is inevitable. There will always be a conflict between the old great power, the old superpower, and the emerging superpower. And this idea goes back all the way to Thucydides, as you probably know, the Greek historian of the Peloponnesian Wars, 5th century BCE. So we refer to the so-called Thucydides trap. If there's a status quo power and there's a revisionist power, there will inevitably be a conflict. Will this conflict indeed be inevitable? Because a true all-out conflict between the United States and China is very close to a third world war, I would argue. Is that inevitable? Well, my answer to this question is probably not. It's not inevitable. Why not? I have three major reasons, and that's the final part of my presentation. First of all, not every transfer or transition from one global power to another global power has necessarily led or inevitably led to conflict. A very good example is the transition from Great Britain as the global power in the 19th century to the United States as the global power in the 20th century. This transition occurred almost without violence between the two parties. There is a second major reason why probably this conflict, this potential conflict, or this actual conflict between China and the United States will not lead to a military conflict, and that, of course, is the presence of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons mostly. China and the United States are both nuclear powers, and whatever you think of nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, they do have a disciplining impact on states and also on relations between major states and global powers. And there is a final argument why I think that a third world war is not a very clear or dangerous prospect, and that is that China has a clear stake in the current global liberal order. China wants to change things, so does Russia, but it doesn't want to change the system in and of itself. The global liberal order created by the United States has, of course, been extremely beneficial to China. And I think that's probably the major reason why these two countries will abstain from, let's say, outright military, maybe not competition, but in any way conflict. Thank you.
And thank you. It's a quite optimistic speech that you just gave. That's nice to hear. Well, let's see if we are just as optimistic after the next thing we learn from Lorena. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, and of course, first of all, thanks to the organizers for putting this together. Thanks for also, of course, Professor Gerrits for this overview of also, I mean, not just the mega trends of power politics and the big challenges of power politics today, but also a reference to the big thinkers like Thucydides, like these really crucial thinkers who have shaped very much of the way in which we understand the world today. I have to admit that I was quite surprised to receive this invitation, and especially when I read the title or the question that we were posed. So whether a third world war is inevitable or not, essentially. Is it a fantasy or a reality? And I'm very surprised because the kind of topics that I work on usually are exactly the opposite. So I work on reconciliation. My book on German-Israeli reconciliation in the aftermath of the Holocaust is essentially about to come out in some 10 days' time. And what I'm really interested in is how countries do manage to sit at the same table and negotiate and have a direct dialogue even in the most tough of the circumstances. So it was an interesting thought experiment, and in a sense, the reason why I've accepted to be here is also because I was surprised that this is the kind of question that would be on students' mind in a hot summer night. And so I have to say that tonight I'm here to share my thoughts. Of course, I will tackle the question right now, but I'm also here to hear what you have to say. And so I'm also very much looking forward to the audience and the questions that we might receive once we're done with the break. Now, I am going to try and share a presentation with you so that you have a bit of an idea of what I will be talking about. Now, what to do when brainstorming? My first port of call was to ask around and see whether what people thought about what the cause of a possible Third World War would look like. Of course, I put in a couple of nice decorations, let's say, including this mention of the known no's, and some of you will remember this, let's say, fateful quote of 2002, of course, and then Rumsfeld saying that there are things that we know, and these are the known knowns. Then there are the things that we know that we don't know, the known unknowns, and then there are the things that we don't know. And this was a sentence that was said within the context of the investigations about whether Iraq was producing weapons of mass destruction and whether it had armed terrorist groups. So, of course, right, tonight we're also talking about, okay, what is it that we know? What is it that we suspect we don't know? And of course, the unknown unknowns that are always lingering in power politics. Too, also, as a reference to what Professor Gerrits just said, the element of the leader psychology there, of course, plays an important role. But let me share you a couple of the answers that I received in my sort of mini open questionnaire by social media. So, and I hope the people who participated will not mind me sharing just very briefly their inputs, which I thought was actually quite brilliant. So, someone putting £10 on China Taiwan, please, which I thought was interesting. And of course, jokes aside, is a reference to the sort of regional tensions that are very much a feature of the global politics that we are witnessing today. And this is also what was said at the beginning. Then I really liked the one on the top right, which is a very academic answer, right? It depends on how you define war and warfare. And that's very true. And I think for all the students who are about to start their classes in September, remember that this is always a key element. So that's a great sort of inputs anytime you're asked the question, so define your terms. That's crucial. Then, of course, the cyber element, the rising geopolitical tension, the scarcity of resources. So when I was then trying to put in order my thoughts and gathering ideas about what to say, I also tried to break this down into essentially 3 sub-questions as well. Third World War, if we had to think about it happening, where would it happen? Why and how would it look like? Of course, there are some tensions everywhere, right? So this is a rather tense moment, but in terms of what's dominated the news, what is dominating the news right now, my thoughts when thinking about one region which is suffering particularly these days, essentially, my thoughts went to the Middle East and to Beirut. This is an image that we are now all very familiar with, unfortunately, and that depicts the city right after the explosion of the 4th of August 2020, an explosion that we know now killed more than 200 people, injured more than 6,000, and was composed by this mushroom cloud that went into the air, but also by a supersonic blast wave that radiated through the city. What is interesting as well in terms of the psychology of the perception of the war is what happened on social media immediately after the explosion. Some of you may have seen it yourselves, that there was a lot of speculation about what kind of explosion this was. And of course, the mushroom cloud sort of being sending around alarm bells. I also have to say, the nuclear experts is sort of immediately assessed that this was not a nuclear explosion, of course, and then this was also very rapidly out in the news. But the public perception and the public reaction was very interesting in this sense. Now, we know also that in terms of the consequences of this blast, these 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, we know that over 300,000 people are now homeless, at least temporarily, that the collective losses are going to be something like $10 to $15 billion. The image that we're seeing right now, which is that of the biggest disaster that Lebanon has seen in peacetime ever, reminded me of a sentence that I heard a month ago. When he retired as foreign minister, as Lebanese foreign minister, Nasser Hitti said that his country was close to becoming a failed state. And this is something that was said in July. So then I looked at these images and I tried to think, well, was he perhaps right? Of course, I hope that the answer is no. But I think it's an interesting question to engage with. And you will see that what I'm trying to do is using Lebanon to reflect about the region more broadly and to reflect also about some general trends and general threat perception right now. I think what's important to say within this specific case is that the blast comes at a time that was already very difficult for Lebanon from an economic perspective. It's one of essentially an unprecedented economic crisis within which the COVID-19 emergency began. And it is in these already very fraught scenario that the blast took place. Just to give you some numbers, unemployment in Lebanon is at 25%. A third of the population is living below the poverty line. And also very importantly, in terms of the population makeup, this is a country, Lebanon is also a country that has suffered very much the consequences of the conflict in Syria. The current refugee population, Syrian refugee population, in a country that is not even 7 million inhabitants, is 1.5 million. So the proportion is huge. That's essentially what I'm trying to say. So it's no surprise then that all UN agencies, and talking about the World Food Programme, the World Health Organization, are essentially warning that there is a humanitarian crisis along the way. We have also seen that there has been widespread protests again. They have been met first with violence, and then they have led to the resignation of the government. And this is, of course, an interesting time, and we will see what happens there. In terms of bringing us back to what the situation in Lebanon was, I also want to remind our viewers that this is a government that was formed not that long ago, because the protests that took place in October 2019 were already so strong that they had caused some very important changes within the government. At the same time, Lebanon is also one of the most educated countries in the region, and it's also a country that has lived through enormous upheavals. So it will be interesting to see what happens now. But you see also what I've highlighted here in the slide, which is essentially a feature of Lebanon and of Lebanese politics. So you see, as I wrote here, there are three main political offices: the president, speaker of parliament, and prime minister. And these three main political offices are divided along sectarian lines in order to represent each of the big communities, and I mean the Maronite Christian, the Shia Muslim, and the Sunni Muslim. And this is has to do with an agreement that dates back to 1943. Why am I mentioning this, and why do I say that this specific national case actually is related to broader regional and perhaps also global tension? Is that the fact that the country has such an intertwining of the demographics, the composition, the ethnic composition, ethnic religious one, with the political offices, renders it very vulnerable to other regional players, in a sense, meddling within Lebanese politics, and really makes it an easy target for interference by external power. And this regional scenario is one which was already quite fraught. Again, for example, many of you will know, and you might have seen as well, that Iran, for example, wields a very important influence in Lebanon, and this is especially through its connection to the movement Hezbollah, which is a Shia, both political and military grouping. And Hezbollah is also structurally linked together with Iran and Syria as well. For Iran, Hezbollah represents a very important proxy. This is, of course, I am now generalizing, but this is an important trend that began after the Iranian Revolution, 1979, and also it intensified in the 1980s up to this day. But also, these, you see that in the map that I have here, what I'm trying to highlight here is also the question of the rivalry with Israel. Again, this is something that we heard in the introduction to this evening, because you might know there are no relations between the two countries. They are, in fact, very delicate, these relations. They fought several rounds of war. The last one was in 2006. But there have been a variety of border incidents since 2006. Again, the last one of which occurred just a couple of days before the blast. That was the 20th of July, and there were reports that some Israeli aircraft had fired rockets towards southern Damascus in order to prevent the transfer of some sophisticated weaponry from Iran to Hezbollah via Syria. So and of course, again, many of you might know this is something that, for example, for Netanyahu and many in Israel, really is a red line. So the fact of possibly having precision-guided missiles so close to Israeli territory. I also have to say, because I'm talking about these regional tensions, right after the explosion, it was very moving in a sense for some. For others, it was still complex, of course. But I don't know, the Tel Aviv municipality illuminated itself with a sort of big Lebanese flag. Israel also tried to offer some help through international channels. But I mean, the relations between these two countries remain almost explosive, on the brink of explosion as well. And this is something which is telling of some broader trends. Of course, I'm talking here about regional antagonisms. I wanted to give you a little bit of background about a region and, what is dominating the news today. But of course, these regional antagonisms are not just present in the Middle East. So of course, we have them in Asia, we have them in other regions as well. And this is really my link to my other question. So I was trying to think, okay, where, but also why, right? I mean, why do these big wars, why do big conflicts start? And of course, regional antagonisms is one of the possible scenarios that can get out of control, especially in presence of certain kinds of weapons and weaponry. But there is another element that I think is important here. I don't think that this is currently Lebanon's biggest problem, not at all. I think Lebanon has to face a lot of economic and social issues. I also should say that the protests since last year, they have not at all been based on sectarian lines at all. And I think and in fact, many people in Lebanon also call for a radical new political system that would go beyond such divides. But I think it's also, if we have to think about the big drivers of conflicts, the question of power is certainly there, but I think also the question of identity. And here is an expression that, Sigmund Freud coined, but was also used to describe ethnic conflicts later on. And it's the question of the so-called narcissism of minor difference, in a sense that the minor differences between groups of humans can be exploited to create these aversions, these divisions into us versus them. And I also wanted to not just focus on a certain region which might be perceived to be far away and exotic and complicated and full of groups that we maybe don't really understand, but this is really something which is also typical of human behavior. So the narcissism of minor difference, and you see it comes, Freud's paper that I'm referring to here is titled Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, but also, and that's about ethnic conflict, much later, Michael Ignatieff's The Warrior's Honor, which was published in the 1990s. I think in terms of the big themes of conflict, this has to be mentioned as well. Now, again, going back to the big drivers of conflict, again, the struggle for resources. You saw that someone mentioned it also in the answers, and I have to say, this is something that we should all definitely keep in mind. Why does the struggle for resources represent a driver of conflict? Well, there is, of course, the competition for resources. This is something, again, that goes back to the very roots of the so-called realist tradition in international thought, and it's something that should be mentioned. But also, and I think what is just as important is that the poor governance of natural resources itself also can be a driver of conflict, as well as the pressures that might exist when the natural resources are subject to transboundary pressures. So when, for example, there is, of course, planet Earth does not really care that much about the geopolitical or national boundaries that exist for humans. And so when a certain natural resource spans a boundary and is therefore subject to transboundary pressures, that is one of the key drivers. These three elements, so the competition, the poor governance, and the transboundary pressures, are also highlighted by the UN as three possible drivers of conflict and issues to keep in mind for the governance of the future. And again, this is just, it's a case that could go under the heading of the regional rivalry, but I thought it was interesting to see in the news yesterday that there is also mounting tension between Turkey and Greece, for example, about the exploitation of gas resources, which are essentially spanning the boundaries between nations, but under the sea as well. Now, if we have to think about the how, the examples that I gave so far, so the idea that there are nations that are competing for resources, that maybe can use identity issues to turn part of the population against a certain ruler. These are quite traditional ways of understanding conflict. But I also should say that this is probably not the kind of conflict that we might see. Of course, it's hard to tell, and I am a historian, so I'm a lot more comfortable looking back than looking ahead. But I think this is also something that has to be said. It has to be said that the space now for years is sort of an environment which is eyed also in competitive terms, in terms of how is it possible to use space, also in a sense to advance one's possible position in case of war, but of course the cyberspace as well, and the question of the vulnerable infrastructure that cyberspace might attack, and the kind of weapons that would be used. I've put here the ones that I think are the most terrifying, the so-called ABC weapons, so atomic, biological, chemical weapons, because again, we have seen international treaties being signed, for example, to try and call. I'm just thinking about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed in 1968, of course, about nuclear weapons in particular, and the fact that it has been signed in 1968, but it's not really, we don't at all live in a nuclear free world. So I think this is also something that we might want to think about together. Now, just to wrap this up, I've mentioned very different things. I've mentioned these regional hotspots. I've mentioned some deep identity-related questions that might be drivers of conflict, resources, and so on. What I'm trying to say here is that there might be some elements that have been with us for a long time and that are still present. Do they make World War III inevitable? I want to agree with Professor Gerrits. No, my answer would also be no. But I think that what is very important, especially in an exchange like this one, is also to think about how the memory of some very devastating kind of conflicts, such as World War II, for example, which is fading right now, what impact might this have for us today? To what extent do we take our institutions for granted? To what extent do we take democratic living together, our living together in a democratic fashion for granted? And I have to say, even though I want to conclude with an optimistic message, but at the same time, it is a message which wants to see all of us a little bit more engaged and aware of just how precious certain kinds of political experiences can be, and really to not take them for granted. So I'm also ending with a call which is not quite that which was quoted by Professor Gerrits of Deng Xiaoping, but also this quote about the need to educate yourself because we will need all of your intelligence, and to stir yourselves because we will need all of your enthusiasm. And I think that with September essentially just around the corner, this might be an interesting call, and I'm of course very interested to hear what the people in the audience have to say and have to ask. So this is it.
Well, thank you very much. It's a beautiful note to end with, I think. And then we'll have a short break of 5 minutes, so you can all get a bit of fresh air, get something to drink, and then we can answer all the questions from the audience at 2027. So I'll see you all back then. Right. Welcome back. So now we have some time to answer the questions from the audience. And I'm going to start with a question from Maya. And well, Maya, thanks to both of you for your interesting talks. And wonders if the COVID-19 virus can negatively influence international relations and thus make a third world war more likely. Who wants to?
I mean, again, nobody really knows, but I mean, COVID has some very unpleasant consequences. First of all, of course, a global economic crisis or a global economic recession, which is much more serious in some countries than in others, but it's present everywhere. An economic crisis is never conducive to international stability. So as far as that is concerned, COVID has an undermining negative impact, could have an undermining negative impact on international relations. The other political consequence of COVID, which may also have negative international consequences, is that it has a negative impact on governance, so on national governance, regional governance. Maybe not so much in our part of the world, but definitely in other parts, because it undermines political legitimacy, political authority, which only adds to how I started my brief presentation. That is that the major feature of international relations today is uncertainty and volatility and instability. So yeah, it's a good question. And the answer can only be if COVID has an impact, as I see it at least, if COVID has an impact on international relations, it will probably further add to these negative features which I already mentioned.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Lorena?
I mean, I guess, no, I will just reinforce this message in the sense that it's true. It's a global pandemic crisis. Does it have to become a global political crisis? No, I don't think so. But I also have to say, I was just teaching a course on global governance when the pandemic started in full swing here in the Netherlands, and many of my students then chose to write exactly about this topic, because I think it is a very important one. It is a very important one to discuss together as well. And what the health emergency becomes a political emergency when the economic, social circumstances are not stable. And I think, of course, a lot of the scenes that we saw, also a lot of the protests, they were also, even if not directly related to COVID-19, but there was an exacerbation of already existing problems. In this sense, COVID-19, I would define it as an excellent, even though dramatic and tragic, highlighter. It doesn't necessarily bring it. What I mean is that it highlights the crisis and the problems that are there. It makes it impossible to look away from them. That is true from an economic perspective, from a social perspective, and from a political perspective as well. Does it have to lead to a new world war? I would also agree, no. But certainly it is a very huge global challenge in this sense.
Yeah, maybe I can just add, I fully agree with Lorena. COVID-19 highlights issues which are already visible, if you like, or perhaps even better, it accelerates problems that we can already see in global politics. And one very specific consequence of COVID could be a further undermining of multilateralism in global politics. And that is already a current phenomenon, I would argue, in international relations, that there is a sort of a return to the national state, which is not necessarily and always negative, but when it leads to a further undermining of multilateral institutions, then of course it becomes something which is more serious. And COVID, at least until now, has clearly further undermined this multilateralism.
Well, connecting to that answer, the next question is from Ziad Jamal, and he wonders if the rise of multilateral bodies such as the Asian Development Bank and the Shanghai Corporation, especially the Eurasian multilateral organizations, signal the death for the unipolar world. such as we've known it since the Cold War with the USA on top?
Well, just a few. I mean, you should make a difference, obviously, between multipolarity and multilateralism. Multipolarity is basically a sort of an image which tells us how power is divided in global politics. Multilateralism is a way of doing international relations, if you like. So they are not necessarily related. Now, multipolarity is definitely over. Because multipolarity was typical, if it existed at all, it was typical for the 1990s when Russia was on its back, when China was still in the early stages of its reforms, and when the United States was a power without president and without competitor. Now that has definitely changed. I mean, the trade war, so there is a war, an ongoing war between the United States and China, is minimally another symptom of the death of multipolarity. I don't know what kind of world we're living in today, whether it's bilateral or whether it's bipolar or multipolar or non-polar, as some people argue. But it's definitely not the unipolar world anymore. The institutions which you mentioned in the question, that's a different story. The institutions are basically examples of how China creates its own international institutions in competition with the US-led international liberal order. China as a state can follow a couple of strategies. It can go against the current liberal order with the IMF and the World Bank and all those other institutions. It can go with the liberal order, which it does to a certain extent. China is, of course, very keen on its position in the UN Security Council. But it can also go along the global liberal order by building its own institutions. Now, the Asian Development Bank is a good example of how China attempts to strengthen its influence in its own environment. That's what all great powers do, at least initially. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is an important institution for another reason, and that is because it's an institution which China carries together with the Russian Federation, with Russia. So it is an institution which some people mistake for a sort of an alliance between Russia and China. If you would ask me, you don't, but still give the answer. I don't think there is any such thing like an alliance between Russia and China, and there will not be in the foreseeable future, for all kinds of different reasons. The countries are closer together than they have been in decades, but it's not an alliance. It's not an anti-Western alliance. Nothing remotely so.
All right. Thank you.
I think, just to add a minimum point on the question of the role of multilateral institutions today. It is true that we are absolutely witnessing, I have to also disclose, unfortunately, I believe a moment in which multilateral institutions are suffering. And why would I say unfortunately? Well, because I think that there are some mechanisms that are absolutely typical of multilateral institutions that make, for example, much easier to predict the behavior of the other countries, and which per se diminish the amount of possible friction that could exist among countries. So when these kind of settings suffer, of course, it's I would say it's not a very positive trend in world politics. At the same time, of course, multilateral institutions have also very limited power, and I think the fact that many of them have essentially almost zero coercion power, that is per se very telling about the ambivalent, fascinating, but also very problematic nature of multilateral institutions in general. So this is more of a, let's say, a theoretical, rather more abstract take, but that I think is also connected to what we are seeing today in the world.
Right. Thank you very much. I hope that answers your question a bit. And then we have a next question from Leon, and she is wondering what your thoughts are on the role of non-state actors, such as, mercenary armies in modern conflicts, which of course are especially involved in conflicts in the Middle East. What are your thoughts on this?
I will just start because I mentioned Hezbollah, so I think that can be a nice hook, and then to start. I mean, Hezbollah in that sense is a very interesting one. It's the State Department in a 2019 report defined it as the best or most armed non-state actor in the whole world. And that is a very interesting example because it also shows just how closely connected non-state actors can be to state actors. It also, it is certainly a topic of our days. This is connected to the vulnerable infrastructure that I discussed, for example, when mentioning this ABC weapons, so atomic, biological, and chemical weapons, because as maybe the people in the audience will know, proliferation of weapons can happen also either vertically or horizontally. And the fact that some of this weaponry might fall into the hands of non-state actors is also a security issue which one should take very seriously. In this sense, really protecting the infrastructure in this sense is paramount. And I say this also with an eye at the back of my mind. I'm also thinking about the fact that the United Arab Emirates are essentially beginning the construction for nuclear reactors, not to be used for weapons, and they have been in touch with the International Atomic Energy Agency very much for this, but that there is going to be I mean, there might be as a question mark also a drive there for nuclear energy also within the Arabian Peninsula. I think that is also something which has to be said in terms of how the region is doing, what are the possible actors that might gain access to certain kind of weaponry. So yeah, non-state actors are certainly an important feature, and also a tricky one to make sense of, but absolutely very good question to counterbalance the attention that we put on states.
Thank you. Can you add anything to that, André?
Well, I mean, I agree. Non-state actors are becoming increasingly important also in within countries, obviously, when talking about issues like conflict and war and peacekeeping and peace building, and also between states. And there's a whole literature on it, of course, on new wars and hybrid wars and different types of wars. But nothing is always what it exactly looks like. I mean, if you talk about mercenaries or private armed forces, with notorious examples like Blackwater in the United States or the Wagner Group in Russia, then these are officially private armed forces, but their links with national armed forces and with national governments are often very, very close. We know it about Blackwater, that played an important role in Iraq, in the occupation of Iraq, and we also know it about the Wagner Group, which was in the news lately when 20 Russian mercenaries were arrested a few days before the elections in Belarus, which probably was a sort of a propaganda ploy by Lukashenko. But the Wagner military group has been active in various places, Central Asia, in Syria, in Central Africa. And despite the fact that private armed forces are explicitly forbidden by Russian law, everybody agrees that it's essentially the private arm of the Russian Ministry of Defense. So that's another development which we see, which again adds to the uncertainty in international relations. That is that governments increasingly so make use of so-called non-state actors, including armed non-state actors, in military conflict situations. And the reasons are obvious. They do so because Putin can always deny that the Wagner Group is part of the Russian establishment. It is, actually. But he can perhaps realistically deny it because of the fact that purely formally it's not part of the national armed forces. So again, it adds again to this element of uncertainty and volatility in international relations. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I hope that answers your question, Leon. Then we go to our next question from Marijn de Boer, and Marijn really has 3 questions, so I'm just going to start with the first one. Um, do you think that studying history is one way to avoid a future war or Third World War? Or is it rather pointless because world leaders do not care about history or do not study history, or history cannot help us?
Okay, so I think I want to start with this one just because I am based at the history department. So let's see. I mean, I absolutely agree with the person who is asking this question of like history in a sense does not repeat itself, and humans the reason why, at least according to me, humans are the most interesting beast to study is that their behavior is exactly so unpredictable. On the other hand, though, why can history be important? That is essentially, rather than looking for exact similarities and prediction, which I really have to say, again, even though I'm very sympathetic to tonight, and I think it is brilliant that we're meeting to discuss this, but it's something that I have to say we should all be very cautious about. The logical exercise, which is core within history, is the trying to understand the causes of events and understanding what is a cause, what is a fact, what counts as a fact and what doesn't, which perspective is included in a certain source and which one isn't. It's something that is an exercise that I believe is essential for any historical age. Perhaps if I have to think of this age also as the age of the, let's say, information war, if we want to think about possible wars that are ongoing, then I think this is perhaps an even more important one, and one in which history is actually urgent because it forces us to make certain choices in our thinking and in our selection and triangulation of the sources. I just want to clarify what I mean by triangulation, which means sort of checking one or two sources against the third one, of course, or multiple, to try and ascertain what happened.
Well, thank you very much. I hope Marianne is satisfied with that. Can you add anything yet, André?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm also affiliated with the Institute for History at Lorena University. I'm a historian by training, and I do think that when studying international relations, we definitely need to pay more attention to history and historical events and historical developments. But politicians, and that's the point of the question, obviously, does historical consciousness, does the knowledge of history helps us to create a more stable world? That's basically how I paraphrase the question. Now, the answer is I'm not too sure here. I mean, politicians use history for all kinds of reasons, to legitimize their actions, to predict actions, to delegitimize actions of their opponents. So you can do with history whatever you like. Moreover, it sounds a bit counterintuitive for a historian. You can have too little history or too little historical consciousness, but you can also have too much, as a matter of fact. I mean, history can also be a factor, an aspect that burdens politics and that makes political reconciliation more difficult. I mean, Lorena mentioned the Lebanese case, the case of Lebanon and Beirut. That's a typical example of a country that has to carry too much history, if you like. The same goes for the Balkans, for example. So every now and then, I think you have to be able, even as a historian, to say, this is too much history. We need less, as a matter of fact. We need not so much less historical consciousness, but trying to keep history away every now and then from actual politics. I mean, there's even a European example here. There were serious problems between Poland and Putin's Russia on their diverse interpretations of the Second World War and when the World War started. So this is another example of how you can use history, or how the use of history can have a negative impact on international relations. So unfortunately, for us historians, we need to be aware that history is not a sort of a deus ex machina in global politics.
Yeah, I mean, that's. I will just very quickly. I think I completely understand, and it is true that sometimes I think I absolutely understand. And the question of the false comparisons, the misuses of history, the abuses of history, that it's certainly there as well. The question of whether we can have too much history, I think it's an open one. Let's leave it as an open one. Is it history? Is that too much maybe meddling? Or is it too much power politics? I don't know. Is that history or not? Let's just leave it open.
All right. Well, we'll do so then. And then we go to my second question. Perhaps you can combine it with his third question as well. Because the second question is, do you think that lack of solidarity or empathy could eventually lead to more religious or ethnic violations? And perhaps this can be combined with the third question, in which he refers to Rutger Bregman's Humankind, his latest book, where Rutger Bregman states that with the rise of agriculture and the beginning of civilization, people started to say, this land is mine, which was the cause of modern conflict. So could further development of civilization therefore lead to further development of conflict, lead to more conflict? What are your thoughts on this?
Typical question for Lorena, I would argue.
Well, I will definitely give this a try. So I think, well, first of all, for those who might not be familiar with this book, it's a really interesting read. So I urge everyone to read it. Rutger Bregman, De meeste mensen deugen in Dutch, and in English is the what was it? The title?
Humankind, a Hopeful History.
Exactly, Humankind. So it's a play with words in the sense that humankind can actually be kind. And that's really the argument of the book there. That is a very interesting read. It's a fascinating one. Again, one in which the uses of history, you also see like how certain authors can use history to make their own cause. I just want to say about this book, it's a very inspiring one. It's a really good read. It's incredibly well written. If we are hardcore realists, then this book is not going to radically change the way in which we look at the world. I guess from a very abstract perspective, of course, a call for solidarity, empathy can only be applauded. Within this kind of evening, in which we are essentially highlighting all the worst traits of humankind and all the most sensitive hotspots, I think it's a very good addition, and it's really a book that I recommend everyone to read. Do we need more solidarity, empathy? Yes, absolutely. Is it what we actually have in the world? Is this what we see? I'm not so sure about that.
All right, thank you. Do you have anything to add or not this time?
Well, I mean, I have to confess that one, I didn't read the book, and two, I do consider myself maybe not a hardcore realist, but in any way a sort of a classical realist in international relations. So yes, obviously we do need more solidarity and we do need more empathy. But what we are discussing here obviously is not individual norms and individual values. What we are talking here about is international relations, and one of the cornerstones of, let's say, the realist interpretation of international relations is on the one hand perhaps an image of mankind which is not too positive, and on the other hand, of course, that there is a difference, unfortunately perhaps, between let's say norms and values and mores at the individual level and at the political level. And since Machiavelli, we know, if you want to accept his message, obviously, that political norms are essentially different from personal norms, fortunately or unfortunately. So even if we will have more solidarity and more empathy, and we will become ever kinder to one another, my point would probably be that's good. That's good in and of itself. Will it have an impact on international relations? Maybe within Europe. I mean, the European Union, after all, is a sort of a construction that is based on overcoming history, and that has a sort of a civilizational streak, so to speak. But it's also very unique. It's very unique globally. So I don't think that it will have a big impact on international or on global politics, unfortunately.
All right, thank you very much. Well, as a classic realist, you might enjoy the next question from David Mendoza Wilson, which I think is quite a beautiful name. His question is whether you believe that the United Nations and other intergovernmental organizations have helped prevent a war on a scale such as the First and Second World War. And building forward on that, do you believe that if Trump loses his elections in November, Joe Biden could reinstate these bodies to support, well, Western ideals such as human rights? Or have these international organizations been undermined already too much to help the world, to save the world from another world war?
Yeah, well, I mean, you yourself put the link with realists. I don't consider myself to be a structural realist or a neo-realist, and obviously no single international relations approach can explain everything. But realists do tend to agree that the strength or the weakness of international organizations is essentially a product of national states. So national states make an international organization either strong or weak. The reason why we have a European Union which functions pretty efficiently, at least in a comparative perspective, is because the member states want the EU to function relatively effectively. So national states are crucial here. That's also the major reason why we have a crisis of multilateralism. That is because individual nation states, and especially the more important ones, are not as interested anymore in multilateral institutions as they were. Well, having said all this, then the question which was posed is, will the election of Biden make a difference? Well, if my analysis is right, then the election of Biden could make a difference, because Biden will have an impact on American foreign policy, and the impact on American foreign policy will definitely be more pro-multilateralism than under Trump. Will that mean the restoration, so to speak, of a universal global human rights regime? I don't think so. I wrote a piece recently on this transfer of power and what it will mean for global human rights, and whether we like it or not. The human rights regime as we know it, or as we knew it until recently, was essentially a product of Western dominance. It was liberal, it was based on individual human rights, etc. That's an aspect of Western tradition, and that will change for the very simple, realist reason that ideas at the global level do represent power relations at the global level. I do believe that there is a link between the two. So if the position of the West globally weakens, that will also imply, almost inevitably in this case, that typically Western ideas, such like liberal individual human rights, will weaken as well. So maybe we have to find, but that's a topic for a different discussion, we have to find and develop new ideas about human rights, which can make the international human rights regime also more effective. We have to take the Chinese and we have to take the Russians on board. Otherwise, we will have a human rights war. And that will be, for the sake of human rights at least, highly ineffective.
Right, thank you. Lorena?
Yeah, I just have to disclose that David was one of the students of the MA in International Relations in Historical Perspective, exactly my very first year here in Utrecht. So hi, David, great to hear your question. And of course, I mean, the answer that Professor Gerrits gave is already very full, so I will not add that much to it. But perhaps, yes, I mean, thinking about historical precedent and what has been what many historians have called the failure, for example, of the League of Nations, exactly because it did not manage to stop the Second World War from happening. I think, in a sense, without being too negative and without sounding too many alarm bells, because I also don't think that that's useful, but also, I guess this goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of just not taking these institutions for granted and maybe not expecting them to do that much, because also, as we just heard now, it is states that make or break them.
All right. Well, thank you. I should add in between that both Leon and Marijn expressed their thankfulness for your answers for the earlier questions. Then I myself had also a question. Going back to your presentation, Lorena, which started with someone answering your question with another question: how do you define world war or world war?
Yes.
And that's answering, given your example of the Middle East as a regional conflict, I was considering, like, if you're considering the amount of states involved in the conflict in Syria, considering that Russia has allegedly put bounties on American soldiers, could you say there's so many countries, part of the world, already involved in the war in Syria that perhaps we're already having a world war, but not as we knew it in the First or Second World War, but more a world proxy war or proxy world war?
This is a really interesting point. I'm also curious to hear what Professor Gerrits would say, because I think it's really, thank you very much for bringing this up. What this means is that we are taken for granted that conflict is not ongoing, but of course it is ongoing. And I think, again, in terms of the perception, the fact that we are living actually in such comfortable circumstances, sometimes detaches us a little bit from what the majority, many parts of the world are going through. And this is what I would say at the outset. However, in order to qualify, does the amount of states that are involved or that have stakes in it, does it make a world war? I would say no, and I will tell you why. And again, that's related to the definition, which is generally related to the death toll. And this is why we call the First and the Second World War as such. And what has been very interesting and exciting to see is that there have been more and more books that have sort of decentered also the histories of these wars, showing how many soldiers, for example, from the colonies fought this war, which otherwise was for many decades also taught as two very European conflicts, but in fact were also global in that sense. And this is the sense of this death toll and participation. So on this one hand, I absolutely agree. It is important. Yes, there are many conflicts that are ongoing, and conflicts in the, let's say, traditional sense of the world. Plus, tonight we also mentioned the economic war going on, the information war, disinformation, and so on. And I think even though these are perhaps not war in the traditional sense of the terms, these are also things that we should look carefully at.
All right, thank you very much. Can you add anything to this, André?
Well, no, I basically agree. I mean, it's a good question, but I think that as serious as it is, because it's an incredibly serious conflict in Syria, it's too limited and too isolated to see it as a sort of world war by proxy or anything. First of all, China is not involved, at least not immediately involved in the conflict. Neither is the United States or the West anymore, at least only indirectly so. So it has become, to a certain extent, at least Russia's war. But when you talk about a world war or a potential world war, then at least the major powers should be involved. And that's not the case in Syria, especially as far as China is concerned.
Yeah, can I just add very quickly also that this question of big power involvement is absolutely crucial. And I think this is something that if we look at the Cold War, so this so-called Cold War that dominated world politics from 1949 to be generous until 1989 or 90, what we are used to call Cold War, in fact, was dominated by a series of hot wars around the globe. But I guess what the superpowers then learned at the time very effectively was the also importance and strategic importance of the proxy conflict rather than the direct one. And this is also a lesson, again, something that we can look back and sort of reflecting in terms of and reflect about in terms of understanding the world that we have today and also the kind of conflicts that we see today.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your answers. I believe you've answered all the questions we've had. So then I think we're done for tonight. So I'd like to thank you again very much for speaking to us here. I have myself enjoyed it very much. I hope everyone watching did as well. I certainly learned a lot. And thanks everyone for watching. And hopefully we'll see each other again in real life when it's possible again, another SIP talk. And then I wish you all very well. Good night. Good evening.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.